Hello everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Not Gnostic. We are currently on episode 18, and as we said last time, guys, we're currently on an every other week sort of schedule, because that's kind of the way it's going to have to work with life. And so, Abby, we sort of had an interesting episode, but for more than just what we discussed during that episode, because I may or may not have made a slight editing mistake when I published that episode.
Yeah, well, beyond our content, it seems that we left a little Easter egg there at the end of the last episode. If you heard it, you would have heard us discussing about, okay, let's end the show here. I think there was kind of some of that it was super green room chatter type of thing.
It was super
raw. And then as Ty was discussing what he was going to do, I decided to yell anus into the microphone.
Oh, well, okay. I didn't think you were actually going to share that on the air, but that's totally fine with me if that's the way you want to do it. I guess we're just addressing the elephant in the room.
If you heard me yell anus, I'm sorry. You just got the kind of Bill O'Reilly-esque behind-the-scenes Abby.
Yes.
And I am sorry for that. But basically, that's what happened.
If you heard this, we would just like to apologize professionally in front of the mic.
Yeah, we would like to professionally apologize. Well, here was the best thing about it is Ty said in the backroom chatter, I'm going to edit that out. And I said, no, you're going to leave it in there. And then Ty, of course, didn't edit it out, ironically. So there was a lot of irony going into this.
It was so
we were
funny,
laughing, and of course we changed it as soon as we found out.
Oh man, I was listening to it after I had published the show. I was listening to it, and I'm sitting there listening to this thing, and all of a sudden I get to the end, and I'm like, shit, I totally forgot to edit this part out. And it's not even that you said a bad word. It's just like, number one, it is kind of an odd thing to say just randomly, but at the same time, like I'm talking about
word.
I'm talking about all this shit I'm gonna do. Like I'm like being super technical about everything. I'm like, oh yeah, hang on, I'm just writing everything down so I don't forget to fucking edit the show. And then I forget to edit the one part I probably should have taken out at the end of the show. And oh man, like at first I was super cringing about it. I was like mentally facepalming so much because I had published it and like 9 people had listened to it at that point, which isn't a lot, granted. And I don't even know if anyone actually reached to the end because...
Yeah, who knows if any of our listeners did. I mean, if you did reach to the end in that, for a brief moment released episode before we fixed it, then great for you. You got a really awesome look at the Not Gnostic podcast behind the scenes and what we really are like in real life. Well, at least what I am. Yeah, so it's interesting.
Well, you don't say it like every second of every day, so that's good.
I do not say it every second of every day. It's just
think you had a tape or something.
Excuse me. It's just something that happened in the last episode, and we are sorry for it. But we do have a awesome discussion today. It is October, and we are getting closer and closer to Halloween. Halloween is a mostly commercial holiday in Japan, and I would argue that it's probably commercial elsewhere, but there's not the trick-or-treating traditions or anything like that around here in our parts of the world, but there is a Halloween decorations going up in stores and things like that. I think, I don't know about you, are you teaching anything on Halloween in your schools?
Well, actually, we're going to do a Halloween lesson to the third years, I think the 26th of this month. We were going to do it a little bit before, and it's funny, I was talking with one of the teachers in the teacher's room, and we were actually talking about, experiences we might have had with the paranormal and things like that, and I was like, no, I've never experienced the paranormal. I think I've talked about that you and I, we have had UFO encounters, or what we think could have possibly been UFO encounters, but I've never had anything happen. And she was like, oh yes, I had a little bit of a paranormal experience or something like that, and she didn't really delve into it at all, although it might have had something to do with maybe she felt something was watching her or something like that at one time. And I've talked with other teachers before about how they thought they were hearing shoes on the sidewalk as they were like leaving school or something one day, and then they turned to look and no one's there. That sort of thing. And of course, that's how rumors spread. But, so yes. It's really interesting, I think. And we will be talking about that with third years. Like, she was like, oh yeah, you can share your UFO experience too. And I'm just like, that doesn't really relate to Halloween though, does it? And she's like, oh, come on. We don't care. And then that would be
awesome. I mean, everyone's got their maybe experiences, right?
Yeah, I love talking about Halloween, man. I don't know, I personally think Halloween is the best holiday. That's just my opinion. But just because I love the festivities, I like that you get to dress up and, obviously, like you said, there's no trick-or-treating here in Japan, but I mean, I'm kind of old for that anyways. I would just go to the store and buy Reese's Cups, which they actually don't have here, which is a pity because I love Reese's Cups.
Yes, they don't. It's a massive disappointment.
I think you might be able to get them on Amazon.
So if you are a listener in the States, please send us some.
But we should probably not put our P.O. boxes on the internet.
No, I'm not going to do that, but I would say, if you're a trustworthy listener, we would like to get some free food from you.
But, this month, we thought we were going to have a bit of a theme. Lots of podcasts do this, lots of shows do this, especially for October. It's always kind of like a fun thing to do, like discussing the paranormal, ghosts, things of that nature, scary shit, basically. And I, for one, am a huge fan of scary shit. So I love horror, huge fan of the genre. And so I think that's what we're going to go into today, right, Abby?
Yes, we have I think an interesting discussion today in regards to the paranormal and its existence. And I think it's important for us to talk about this because we talk about God and we talk about the belief in God and maybe religious beliefs for a big part of our podcast. But I think that it relates very closely to God because I think, oddly enough, there might be some correlations between the belief of God and paranormal or even aliens.
Yeah.
So I want to start off by bringing up an article that I read on the Scientific American, and it's called Belief in Aliens May Be a Religious Impulse. Now, I wouldn't necessarily put aliens within the paranormal category because I think that they sort of exist in a different category, but I think this article points out some kind of big points, and I think it's important for us to look at them. The first thing is, it points out that, God is an alien, right? And vice versa. And these two things are sort of the same thing. And then it also points out that, in a way, our desires for there to be more out there exists across the board, and we want maybe there to be extraterrestrial
And you know
life.
What? Can I interject here really quick? Just because I think it's interesting. Yes. I think point number 2 is very interesting because yesterday, we briefly talked about it, and I think that it kind of actually opened up a new perspective for me to look at things differently because, beliefs are very complex, very, very complex. So you may find someone doesn't believe in God, but they believe in extraterrestrials. Or you may find someone believes in ghosts, but they don't believe in extraterrestrials. Or they believe in God, don't believe in extraterrestrials. And like vice versa, like all the way around. Like there are so many different combinations that people generally come into. And yes, you can have the extremes. You can have one where people believe in all of it, or where people believe in none of it. And to me, it's just interesting though that the desire for there to be more out there, when I've come to terms with the fact that there may be no God. Okay. And I say the fact that let's not confuse that with me making an objective statement. I'm just saying that if it is a fact that there is no God, I have come to terms with that. I, of course, do not know whether or not God does exist. Although I am a proponent of there being, like, if there's, like, no evidence of something, pretty strong evidence that something doesn't exist, especially in the case of God. But that's for another discussion, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think you bring up a really good point there, though. This article talks about, a couple studies done about people that specifically believe in maybe the extraterrestrials. Right. And he cites two studies, the writer of this, his name is Michael Shermer, and he cites two studies. The first one he studies is that those who report low levels of religious belief, a high desire for meaning in life, show greater belief in ETIs. And in the second study, those who self-identified as either atheist or agnostic were statistically significantly more likely to report believing in ETIs than those who reported being religious.
Yes, and I thought that was...
And that would be primarily Christian.
And I thought that was incredibly interesting.
And what's really interesting about that is that let's take aliens outside of this. Now, I realize that these studies weren't asking people about aliens, but it's funny to me that you have this paradox of people that would deny the existence of God, but would accept the existence of aliens or the paranormal. And it's interesting to me because both of those things sort of seem the same. Aliens, God, paranormal, they're all kind of the same thing. But atheists, according to this study, are more willing to accept that. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. I think, first of all, the way at least aliens have been presented in our media has always kind of come in a more scientific approach.
Yeah.
It seems like, okay, we can prove with science that, extraterrestrial life
and they've always got these
God doesn't.
They've always got this like high advanced technology sort of aspect to them, like super sci-fi stuff, whereas ghosts, on the other hand, they're always associated with old things. Like it seems like, things that have passed on and things that have died and stuff like that. And it always deals with the past that, I don't know, it seems to be fleeting for a lot of people. And then, but for the future, like aliens, it's an interesting, like, side-by-side comparison when you think about it. Like, science is more willing, I think, to jump on the extraterrestrial train because that, to me, it's more like future-oriented, and science can more easily get on something that is more future-oriented, things that are, like, still observable within the material realm. Like, people will, yes, they will say that, because, if you do the math, then, aliens couldn't possibly be on the planet. But then, there's a pretty easy counter argument to that when you just say that, well, if you use our human understanding of the universe, if they're an advanced civilization, then it kind of makes our mathematics obsolete, basically. So it's those kinds of things. And so when you think about it like that, when you think about how much science doesn't know, that's where aliens fall into. Except God still falls out of that scope, but at the same time, it's just so far out there when you think of it in terms of science capability. I think more people think that aliens, super advanced things like that we associate with extraterrestrials or UFOs, are more within the scope of science and objective reality, I feel like, in a way. I don't know if I'm rambling on there.
Well, I'm not saying that, I'm not going to argue that that's wrong. But I also think we have to think about, in popular culture, the way some of these things have been presented to us.
Right.
In that aliens have always kind of come across as like, we can prove this with science, whereas God is such something different. But what the author of this article points out that I really like, what Michael Shermer points out at the end, he kind of talks about, he says this, and I think that it's important for people to hear this. Okay. And I think this is going to kind of fuel our discussion and our questions for the rest of the day as we talk about the paranormal and things like that. Given that there is no evidence for aliens than there is for God. Okay. There's no more evidence for aliens than there is for God. Believers in either one must take a leap of faith or else suspend judgment without evidence emerges, until evidence emerges to the contrary. He says, I can conceive of what might be an ETI, but not for God, unless the deity is sufficiently advanced ETI as to appear divine. And then he goes to Star Trek at the end, the wonderful episode.
It was a really
Star
interesting
Trek film. I believe it's Star Trek 5, where they find God. He says, perhaps Captain Kirk has it right in his final reflections on God to the ship's doctor at the end of Star Trek 5. Maybe he's not out there, Bones. Maybe he's right here in the human heart. And what I really like about that quote is that it really is this desire for us, whether we're atheist or not, whether we believe in God or not, whether we believe in ghosts or aliens, any of these possibilities.
Right.
We want there to be more out there.
Yes,
than
and
just
that's
us. And I think that's kind of where this entire discussion and these entire desires stem from, is just our human desire to not be alone in the world.
And earlier, I was thinking that, like, you know, when going back to like the whole thing I was talking about earlier, like, you know, I've come to terms with but there may be no God. I've come to terms with that, as it's mentioned in the article and things like that. But at the same time, I really find myself wanting to believe in things like the paranormal and things like UFOs. I'm less willing to believe in the paranormal, but I'm more willing to believe in things like UFOs because, you know, I remember having an experience that I think was a UFO, basically. And so it's just interesting that our desires, like, we lead that desire for there to be more, like, a more interesting reality, or maybe we just don't want to be alone in the universe or something. Like, we lead that, maybe one avenue is blocked off. Okay, I don't believe in God. But immediately it seems like the human perspective will change. We'll try to, like, explore every single outlet before arriving at a certain conclusion about reality. And I feel like I'm still exploring, you know, whether or not I think the paranormal is a feasible thing, or UFOs are a feasible thing, like extraterrestrial UFOs and things like that. And I think point number 2 was really interesting, and we should definitely extend upon that more. And actually, when going back to the Star Trek thing, like, about how did he know if he actually found God? A lot of people, when you're reading these online debates about the existence of God, they often ask the question, how would you distinguish whether something is just a super powerful extraterrestrial being or if it's really God? And I've never seen, like, I don't think I've ever seen a satisfactory answer to that question. I've never seen someone be able to answer that in a way that I felt like made any sense, you know? And so that's another interesting point.
Well, and I think that you could put that in the same category for when people bring up their own ghost stories or encounters with aliens or UFOs. To me, it all kind of falls in the same thing. It's like, well, if I'm going to have to, like, if I don't believe in God, then maybe I like the idea of aliens existing or something like that. But then again, it's like, well, then maybe I just like the idea of God existing too, you know, and maybe not the God of the Bible, but just this idea of, like, I want there to be more out there. And I just don't think that I can really suspend myself to say aliens exist 100%, but God doesn't. I can't. I think I have to be skeptical about both equally.
And
because
I agree.
If I don't, I feel like I sort of am being a little bit hypocritical in a way.
But at the same time, like, I mean, you can't really help what people believe. Like, I think you can recognize yourself when, like, I think it's important to recognize when you may be a bit hypocritical, you know? But I still think it's okay to be like, okay, I think I believe more in extraterrestrials or more in ghosts, whatever. But I still realize I'm going to separate objective fact from that, objective reality from that. And I'm going to realize that that's not necessarily the most logical stance, but it's still my stance. Like, I think that's totally fine as well. Like, so long as you're able to distinguish between what you believe and what is objective reality, pretty much. And I think that's a very key distinction that needs to be made. And I think it's a lot of people make the mistake of beliefs, like when they state something, they make it sound like it's an objective fact rather than what they just believe. And we actually watched a very interesting TED Talk video, didn't we, on that?
Yes, we did.
Yes, so we watched a TED Talk video on, I guess, a skeptical look.
It's called A Scientific Approach to the Paranormal.
Yes. A Scientific Approach to the Paranormal, and it was by Carrie...
From Carrie Poppy.
Carrie Poppy, that's right.
Carrie Poppy.
Carrie Poppy, yes. And it was a very interesting video, how she describes her own, like, experience in a quote-unquote haunted house. You know, she tried the ritualistic approach when she felt like there was, like, a ghost in the house, you know, burning the sage, which, I mean, someone tells me to burn sage, and I'm probably not gonna put a lot of faith into their methodology, but So she burned the sage, realized it wasn't happening, and then she called a group that investigates things from a scientific perspective, like under rigorously controlled environments. Basically, they investigate claims of the paranormal, but they do it from a scientific standpoint. And we're not talking TAPS ghost hunters, okay? We're not talking TAPS ghost hunters. TAPS ghost hunters, in my opinion, is more in it for the ratings because it's a reality TV show than it is actually about proving whether or not the paranormal exists. You know, I used to love TAPS ghost hunters as a kid, and then I grew up and I realized they kind of are not actually as scientific as I'd have wanted them to be. I don't know, did you ever watch the TAPS ghost hunters back in the day?
Yeah, of course, you know. Of course I was into those things. I mean, it's television. So
right.
I'm not going to buy into any of it, to be honest.
I was kind of hook, line, and sucker.
Definitely it captivated my imagination.
I was totally hooked on that shit. I believed it. Like, I was like, dude, this is legit. These guys are awesome. They're being scientific. And then, like, you go back through the videos after you've grown up, and you're like, how did I believe any of this? Like, you know, there's so many obvious things I feel like to point out. But anyways, these guys are not, the guys in the video she mentions are not TAPS ghost hunters, okay? They don't bring spirit boxes.
So what did they end up discovering about her home?
Can we talk about that? Yeah, so what they ended up doing was they like, they're a group whose stance is, like, they just try to prove, or they just try to, I think they go in with the mind of disproving paranormal claims. And so she called them, and as sort of a challenge. So she calls them, and they're like, okay, did you check your, carbon monoxide detector? That's right. Have you checked the carbon monoxide levels in your home? And long story short, she has a guy come out and check the carbon monoxide thing, and the levels are too high, and if she hadn't done it since then, she could have easily died.
Right. Well, the important thing to point out here is that high carbon monoxide levels produce feelings of dread, feelings of, you know, maybe being watched, those kind of feelings of dread, difficulty breathing. They can also kind of create sounds in your head, voices, you know, and so these are things that we might associate with ghosts. And she says this because she kind of brings up this idea that when we have a lack of evidence for things, we want to subscribe it to ideas that are much more, you know, mythic, if you will. But I think what's really important about this video and her discussion is she brings up kind of this question of, can the paranormal be studied by science, right? Can we scientifically try and prove that these things exist? And she even actually mentions the idea of God in her talk as well. Can we study these things by science? And that's a very difficult thing, because she brings up two things that I think get missed by this whole conversation, and I really like what she said. She talks about the idea of an inner truth and an outer truth. An inner truth being something that's, you know, very personal, and outer truth that's something that can be proved by observable facts, right? So people can believe in ghosts or God or aliens, but this might be an inner truth idea, or people might believe, as she says, that Jesus rose from the dead, which is a very inner truth type of thing. But we want people to, she talks about, we want people to prove inner truth ideas with outer truth evidence. And it's just something that necessarily can't happen. Even if you believe something so dearly in your heart as being real or true, based on your experiences, whether it was the presence or an experience with God or an alien or a paranormal, you know, entity, we don't have the physical proof that science can give us to prove any of these things actually exist.
And, you know, those are the things that people often mix up the most, you know, in debates. They want to try so hard to prove that what they believe is right. You know, whether you're an atheist or whether you're agnostic, whether you're Gnostic, you know, people want to be right no matter what. And I think it's honestly just fine letting it be. You know, like, what's the point of, like, getting into all these arguments? Unless, like, of course, when it comes to things like politics, you absolutely should get involved, I think, because, you know, number one, we let inner truth, once we start letting inner truths, you know, things from the Bible that we believe to be true. That, in my opinion, would be an inner truth sort of thing. Once we allow those things to take control of certain policies that affect other people, that's when I think we need to be like, whoa, pull back the reins. You shouldn't be like dictating things from an inner truth standpoint, because that's not objective. But like, other than that,
sure, but
we should just
let's
let
not
it be.
get too
like,
off track here.
Well, we're not. I'm just saying that, like, we should, like, it's fine to just it's fun to speculate on things like whether the paranormal is real, whether extraterrestrials are real, whether God is real. It's fun to speculate on that. And I mean, there's just not a whole lot of reason behind arguing.
Well, I think that one thing Carrie points out in her talk is that, you know, she's not against inner truth ideas. She talks about like how every time, because she became an investigator after her personal experience and investigating paranormal claims. And she's always kind of trying to base these things with science. And I think what's really important is there's probably, she talks about 10 times out of 10, there's a scientific explanation for what's happening. But if she says there's the 70% of her that wants it to be a ghost, or wants it to be this or that, you know, that's actually doing the thing. Because how cool would it be if you actually discovered that was true, or an alien was true, or God was true? You know, 100% true. These inner truth claims that are part of our human experience, just as much a part of as what's observable in our world. You know, we want, maybe if we could prove it by science, that would be awesome, right? But it ultimately, they're two different things. And so I think that it's important for us to value, though, inner truths. And so the idea of like ghosts being real and stuff, like those experiences that people might have had are just as valid as the people that claim that they've been in the presence of God, that they heard God's voice, or, you know, any of those things. They're both very valid. And we can't, same with UFOs too. We can't necessarily discredit anything.
Well, no, because, right? I mean, science, number one, doesn't have the means to possibly investigate every single claim of the supernatural or every single UFO thing. Because, like, you know, a common theme within all of these experiences is they're unmeasurable. Literally, like, there's no one was not like, and even when you do measure it, you know, like, hell, okay, you could seriously film someone levitating an object, right? You could seriously film someone levitating an object, and you send that video to me, and I'm probably not going to believe it, to be honest with you. It could be 100% legit, even, and I probably wouldn't believe it. I would have to be there. I would have to make sure there's no sort of trick wires, no magnetism, nothing like that. I would need to make sure it's a control, yada, 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 you know, red tape stuff. And, like, it's there because to measure the observable world. And when she says something like a 10 out of 10, you know, the explanation, like, science explains it 10 out of 10. I mean, just look at science's track record for one, okay? Look at religion's track record for another, for example, if we're going to compare things. You know, back in the day, lightning, you know, was believed to be thrown by God or something like that, you know, come from the heavens. Like, no one understood it. They just ascribed meaning to what they were seeing because that's all they knew how to do. And so, you know, it's easier to go through life when you have an explanation for something, I think. And when you don't understand something, you just ascribe something to that. Now, as an atheist, and, you know, I'm fine with just, like, you know, not knowing everything. But back in the day, they saw that lightning and they're like, yeah, that's God basically just tossing down lightning. Now, of course, science understands, like, the very complex nature behind lightning. And who knows? Maybe ghosts are a legitimate phenomenon. We don't know. What if they are? And, you know, they're only there under specific conditions, but they are still, like, scientifically explainable. We just won't know for thousands of years. Like, it took a long time to understand science.
It's really hard to say, man. And it's really hard to say.
I love her attitude too. So,
well, I think it's interesting that you bring that up because Michael Shermer, the guy who wrote the previous article we talked about, also writes one, you know, called "Is It Possible to Measure Supernatural or Paranormal Phenomena?" And he brings up the point of plagues and things were formerly, you know, maybe ascribed or blamed on women who were, deviling or witches or, but in reality, we realized, these were caused by bacteria and viruses. And he brings up mental illnesses, it was being, this is demonic possession. But, it's like, okay, no, this is like neurochemistry and, psychological problems here.
Right.
And even just accidents are things that happen, it's just, we ascribe meaning to things to kind of get through things that we don't understand. And I think that is a massive part of the human experience. And I think I value science. I want to explore all things with science, and I think science should start to explore more of these ideas and not be afraid to kind of explore these ideas of kind of the inner truth things that we believe. Because even though they might feel, it's silly, I think science sort of kind of does itself a disservice when they're like, well, we aren't going to look into the ideas of there being ghosts out there or finding Bigfoot or, whatever it is, or finding God, because it's just silly. We all know it's a myth. Well, it's like, well, okay, yes, we are kind of looking at two different things, and it's kind of hard to kind of come up with a scientific method to measure any of these things and experiments. But we have to really think about why it matters to us as humans to have the scientific explanation for things, and equally, if not more, the stories that we have about why things aren't.
Stories, man.
Creation myths are a big
stories,
part of that.
Have always been a part of the human experience, whether it's dealt with, the Christian God, or whether it's dealt with, that ghost your uncle saw that one night while out in the field. It's like stories have been invaluable to the human experience, I think, almost even arguably more so than science, because, they've helped so much. But I think it's really interesting that it doesn't really help. Like science, yes, science mocks the paranormal, which I think is wrong. It should take a serious look at everything. I think it's okay to have the attitude, we're going to go in here to disprove it, not prove the claim. Although, you could argue that, yes, that's a bit of a bias standpoint, but arguably, that's the best way to do it. You go in with the mindset of disproving it, and if you can't disprove it, that Sherlock Holmes quote comes to mind. No matter what, even if it seems impossible, must be probable, or something like that. I'm sure I butchered it, but I think science, yes, does have the tendency to mock it, but popular culture doesn't help either. People don't help either, and so many
that's
people,
exactly right.
So many people lie. So many people are frauds. Walking down a street here in Japan, like a popular street, and you'll find shops where people are like, "Oh, would you like me to tell your fortune?" and stuff like that. And yes, there are people who have claimed to be legitimate psychics, legitimate fortune tellers. Whether or not that's real, whether or not there are any real fortune tellers, I don't know. But I just think that, people, it has sort of become a mockery in itself because of the way people have treated it. And so it's something that materialistic science, at least, cannot take seriously. And I do think there are more important things that materialistic science should be focused on, rather than, chasing a ghost in the dark, or, trying to find a spaceship that may just be a satellite passing over the sky, But for the people that do the investigations, on the side, I have a great amount of respect for those people. If they do it from a seriously scientific perspective, and there are people out there who do that, I have a lot of respect for them, because they're the ones who kind of save face for science when the majority of science decides that, no, we're not going to take a look because we don't believe it, which I think is a wrong stance to take personally. I have a lot of respect for people who kind of just go back in there. They go in with a scientific mindset, and they try to really determine whether or not claims of the paranormal or UFOs are even legit. And I think that's important. I think that's absolutely important.
Okay. Well, so let's ask this. What, if you were to say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how sure are you that God exists? On a scale of 1 to 10.
Let's see, 1 to 10. So I'm gonna say 3 or 4, perhaps.
Okay. How sure are you that ghosts or paranormal entities.
Well, if we're
exist.
talking about certainty, okay, actually, gosh darn it. Now I'm thinking of the question differently, actually, in my mind. I was thinking, so God exists, sure. Certainly, certainty I'll stay at a 2 or 3 because I'm unsure, but I'm not really sure. I don't believe. But, which I guess that's weird. Anyways, so for the second one, how certain am I that ghosts exist? I'm probably at a 0 or a 1 on that one.
Okay. What about aliens?
That one I'm going to probably put... Ooh, let's see. I want to put there around 7-ish, I think, actually. Yeah.
It's interesting. I put it at the same level. Probably. I mean,
Really? Interesting.
I don't believe that ghosts necessarily exist. It seems a little
I want to believe
to me. I mean, really I'm sure that there are paranormal things out there, but it's like when people are like, well, these demonic things happened, or like, it's like, well, if those things exist, like just in my mind and in my experience, it's like, well, like then obviously God has to exist. Like those two things kind of go hand in hand. I mean, to me.
Yeah, but that's
and then aliens are just a completely different thing. Like for me, it's like, hell yeah, there has to be life out there. There's no way that we are the only life forms in the universe.
And that's what I'm talking about with
intelligence and civilizations.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm talking about with the whole scientific aspect. Like, aliens do legitimately, I feel, have a scientific, like a theoretical, at least scientific backing. Ghosts, I mean, yes, there are some scientific theories revolving around why people may, I've heard of stories where people will be walking through an old part of town and suddenly it'll be bustling with life, and they'll see people dressed from the old times walk by them, and then it'll disappear, and there's some scientific theories where if it's near quartz rock, that quartz might somehow be able to record events in time or something like that. And I mean, I don't think I buy that. I'm not sure that I buy that. But so there are scientific theories, and, but I just, again, I've had a UFO experience that I genuinely believe was a legitimate UFO experience. And so I would naturally put but even if I didn't, I would still probably put extraterrestrials about that high, just from a scientific standpoint.
Right.
And when
fair. I think it's fair.
Yeah. And when you talk about God and ghosts, it becomes a bit more tough to explain, I think, especially since, God, that's such a huge concept. What is God?
Yeah, but then again, so is aliens. I mean, I realize that God's kind of a different thing. It's like an all-knowing being. If we're going to look at God of the Bible, omnipresent, omniscient, all-knowing, whatever. But at the same time, too, I mean, I, for one, at some point in my life, believed that I had authentic experiences with an almighty creator. And I look back on that and I don't think it was. And I also feel like I've had an experience with an extraterrestrial as well in my life, but I don't really know what. And I feel like if I'm going to say, oh, that was definitely an alien, but yeah, God doesn't exist and those experiences are invalid, it's like, well, I don't know. Both experiences are sort of valid, actually. And whether that was just me assigning more meaning to than what I should have, or I actually had a legitimate experience with both of those things, then fine. But it's really also hard for me to say, yeah, God is not real, aliens are. It's actually equally as hard.
But again, I think we're running into the issue of inner truth statements and outer truth statements. What you are making there are outer truth statements, and I think it's okay to make the statement that, okay, if you believe one thing, this is an objective statement. If you believe one thing, then you have to give equal credence to the other things. If you believe extraterrestrials or ghosts are real, then you have to give equal credence to the possibility that God may be real. And that would be stating it from a logical standpoint, and that's fantastic. That's a logical standpoint. That would be a sort of outer truth kind of statement, I think, in my opinion, because you're recognizing that to believe in one means that other things are equally as possible. But when it comes to the inner truth statements, again, when it comes to the inner truth stuff, you can still say, but, this is the caveat, right? But despite the fact I recognize that logically speaking it doesn't make sense, I still think UFOs are more possible than ghosts, but perhaps God is a different likelihood than ghosts, vice versa, all those kind of things, because those are inner truth statements.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point.
And I think we need to be careful, because we need to make sure that we don't mix inner truth with outer truth. And this is the problem we see in debates all the time. People want to try to prove their inner truth statements by making outer truth claims. But that's not that. Like, that's what I was trying to make the whole point I was making with the argument earlier. Like, just let your inner beliefs be. Like, you don't have to like constantly argue about things like this, you know, except for when shit hits the fan in politics, then, you know, that's where I would do it. And then, but like, again, inner truths and outer truths, those are very important to distinguish between.
I agree. That was a really well said statement. And I think it sort of brings a nice cap to this whole conversation in a way. You know, and I think, you know, it's in that month where we explore the idea of, the possibility of paranormal things, and I think Halloween, the way it's been marketed to us through time, has created that. I think that it has its place in the world, and there's a reason why we celebrate these things.
And hey, like, whether you believe in it or not, like, horror movies are awesome, and so...
Oh, heck yeah, man. They have a place in our world. All of those things.
I will always appreciate the stories, no matter how unbelievable they are, just because I love the mythos behind it. And, you know, again, we've just come full circle with the whole mythos thing and like the human experience. You know, stories are important in our lives, even if those stories turn out to be false, I think, from an objective standpoint. But I mean, I think we're going to leave it here. Hopefully this time I do not edit the episode at 11 o'clock at night while browsing Reddit and completely forget to, edit out the word anus, although we didn't really say it, so I guess although I just said it.
Yeah, well, it's alright.
You know, whatever. It's alright. It's alright. So anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed it. I guess we will see
everyone in 2 weeks, right?
In about 2 weeks, yes, and hopefully we have another good episode coming, and we are still going to keep with the theme, the paranormal, because I love October, and I just want to keep talking about this stuff. Anyways, guys, thanks for listening to this week's episode of Not Gnostic. We will see you in a couple weeks. Peace.